Paul Demeda holds a Bachelor of Fine Arts from the Visual Arts program at York University. He also holds a Certificate of Achievement in the Teacher Training program. He is a graduate of the Institute of Holistic Nutrition, and he incorporates his education and design experience as well as his past on-stage experience as a musician and performing into facilitating a well-structured, dynamic classroom experience. Paul runs a very busy and successful practice in the Toronto and West End area of Toronto. He's at the Davignon Digestive Healthcare Center on the Danforth, where he specializes and works with individuals that face multiple health challenges, including chronic disease and acute chronic conditions. He is also very passionate about reducing environmental exposures to toxins and encourages all his clients with beneficial lifestyle choices. Paul became extremely passionate about nutrition and helping others as a result of his own developing and successfully overcoming debilitating multiple chemical sensitivities. He brings that passion to both his integrative clinic private practice and also to his classes at IHN. Paul also works at the Orthomolecular Society and does an immense amount of research presenting in the public realm and in the private sector. At the Institute of Holistic Nutrition, he teaches nutrition and health, the fundamentals in our core program, and also teaches clinical detoxification in our continuing education program. And Paul has been an incredible faculty member with us now for over a decade, and he has also taught at every single IHN campus, including Ottawa, Vancouver, and he has taught in Toronto and Mississauga as well. Presently, Paul teaches the fundamentals in the Mississauga campus, and we are delighted to have him here today. Let's welcome Paul Demeda.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Can you hear me? Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, you sounds great.
Hear you.
All right, great. Well, thanks, Elizabeth. I'm happy to be here today to be talking about anxiety and stress and depression. Mental health is one of my passions. I actually got into nutrition and what I do because I had chemical sensitivities, and the path for me to get out of that was through nutrition and health and really doing the right things in the right order with some proper guidance. I actually went to IHN way back when, and I remember it fondly as an intense but also very rewarding year. It was nice to actually be in the presence of people who understood the importance of nutrition, and so it's good to be in a room full of people who were like-minded, which I was not exposed to for the years prior. Since I graduated, I've done a lot of things. I do have 2 practices in the city, and I teach, obviously. I also do projects. I do speaking engagements, and currently I am a program facilitator for the International Society for Orthomolecular Medicine. It's quite fascinating that I took no chemistry and very little science in high school, none in university, and yet after going to IHN and graduating, I was able to basically take my path wherever I wanted to, which is highly science-based now, and so that's pretty good. And that's about it. One of the things I like about teaching at IHN is the energy of the people in the room. One thing I found when I went to IHN was I was learning about things I wanted to learn about, and it was way easier to learn that stuff. Same thing with teaching. I'm in a room of people who want to learn about nutrition, holistic medicine, or holistic practices, and so that makes things go very well. So I think we're going to start now, and I am going to start my talk addressing stress, anxiety, depression with food and nutrients. And So I'm going to start by talking about mental health because the path to understanding how to address something is through understanding what causes it and what's behind it. And that works on a bunch of levels, but mainly because if you understand how things work, then there's more than one option. You don't have to just go look in a book and look up the answer. You can tailor the answers to or what you do based on the person. So we're going to start with what mental health is. And that starts with the composition of the brain. What is it made of? And we're going to talk about that. How is it built? What's the structure? What kind of chemistry is going on? The immune system plays a major role in mental health. Thoughts are also tied into this, but thoughts are a product of the first four items. We tend to think our thoughts are there all the time, which they are, but they are generated anew. But I've seen research that says about 80% of everything we think and do is actually pre-programming. So thoughts play a role, but they're not the major. They are the result of the composition, structure, chemistry, and the way the immune's working. It's going to give a brief overview of how the brain works. And so the brain is divided up into certain regions or different regions, and each of the regions is responsible for things that are going on in the body. I'm not going to go deep into those. The brain is made up of brain cells. Showing you a picture of a neuron here. The neurons are considered to be everything that happens in the brain, but it's not. The neurons are just one component of the brain, and other brain cells are also tied into the way the brain works. So what's really important is the wiring. So neurons are lined up in certain pathways, and you can kind of see someone on the image there. And they all sort of start in the central region and then go to the front of the brain and then back. Ultimately, the wiring goes through the brain and follows these pathways. That wiring can change, and it does change depending on nutrients, inflammation, immune system, trauma, and things like that. The major activity in the brain happens in the cell membranes, and that is the wrapper around all the cells. And in this diagram, we see it's basically two layers. There are glycerol backbones on the outside and fatty acids. The green little squiggly things are the fatty acids, and they kind of make a sandwich. And so we have a water-based medium on the outside of the cell, a water-based medium on the inside, and then a fatty acid layer regulating what comes in and what goes out. And that's that. The neurochemistry, so the brain works not only by the structure and the pathways and the wiring, but also the chemicals. And the chemicals carry signals down neurons and then throughout the body ultimately. And so the chemical balance is important, and chemical structure, and we'll get more into that. That is essentially what mental health is composed of. We're going to look at some of the neurochemistry here. We have probably about 150 chemicals in the brain that are all tied to the way we feel and the way we think, but there are a few dominant ones. These are the ones I like to talk about most. I'm just going to go through what they do. So we have acetylcholine tied to memory, arousal, attention. Dopamine gives meaning and significance to things. So people are low dopamine. They don't really get a lot of feeling of value out of life because nothing's significant. Dopamine also drives motivation. We have norepinephrine, which regulates fight or flight, but also attention, alertness, and learning. Norepinephrine is actually made from dopamine, so we need the both of them, and we need them both in balance. Cortisol is tied to our stress response. Serotonin gives us a calm and blissful, but also the sense of social engagement. And melatonin is a brain antioxidant, so it basically protects the brain. Melatonin is made from serotonin. We have glutamate and GABA and histamine. I'm going to do histamine first. Histamine is tied to anxiety, but it amplifies signals in the brain. And GABA and glutamate are the last two. Glutamate is excitatory, so it makes everything that's going on in the brain more potent or more of a stimulus. And GABA is inhibitory, and what it does is it calms things. But 80% of all the neurotransmission in the brain is GABA and glutamate. So we have a diagram that shows that glutamate is made into GABA. That's how we regulate it. Cortisol counters serotonin, so we have this balance in the brain. Epinephrine is made from dopamine, and arachidonic acid and DHA are two fatty acids. So in the brain, this is how we maintain balance. The interesting thing is all of this balance in the brain is largely controlled by nutrients. So what you put in your body determines the balance of the neurochemistry in your brain. Function is the last thing we need to talk about. The brain actually needs to work properly. The neurons need to work properly, the neurotransmitters. This diagram basically shows what happens at the end of one neuron and the beginning of another. And there are a lot of things going on. Every single one of those things can be modulated by nutrients or environment, both good and bad. Thoughts tie into it. I already talked to them about a little bit. They're largely the result of everything I just talked about, but they also have the capacity to influence what is going on physically and chemically in the brain. So we need nutrients for healthy brain function. I'm going to talk about a few of them and why. So nutrients are need for fuel, structure, and biochemistry. By the way, the brain is made of what we eat. The brain is made and runs on what we put in the body. What else could it be made from? So we have fuel, so from nutrients, structure, neurochemistry. We talk about protein. All neurotransmitters are protein-based, so you need protein for that. Protein, I've drawn it here as a long string of amino acids, those are the little circles. And so protein behaves as protein, and then we can take amino acids that build protein, and the single amino acids also have properties in the body and in the brain. Two amino acids we're going to look at are tryptophan and tyrosine. So tryptophan comes from animal meats, poultry, eggs, and dairy, fish, crustaceans. There's some in soy and some in spinach. The interesting thing is this is from Dr. Greenblatt, who is one of the world experts on mental health. Tryptophan is the lowest amino acid in the diet. It's one of the most important, and yet it's the lowest in the diet, whether you're eating animal-based or vegetarian or even vegan. So if we look at what happens to tryptophan, it comes from the diet. We pull the tryptophan out, we absorb it. It's converted by the body to 5-HTP, so 5-hydroxytryptophan, which is then converted by some enzymes into serotonin to give us a calm and blissful, and then melatonin, which gives us circadian rhythm, acts as a main antioxidant. The pathway for that is nutrient dependence. We need vitamin C, we need vitamin D, vitamin B6, and magnesium. And we need something called SAMe, which is part of the methionine cycle. It's also a molecule that's important. So these are all nutrients. Tryptophan has some issues. Serotonin gives us the calm and blissful. So a lot of people consider it to be antidepressant quality. And so tryptophan is important, but if we are deficient in vitamin B3, tryptophan gets essentially made into vitamin B3. If we have dysbiosis or bad stuff going on in the digestive tract, too many bad bacteria, yeast and molds, the tryptophan can get converted into toxins. And if we have ongoing chronic infections, tryptophan gets converted into something called quinolinic acid. And quinolinic acid and the metabolites before you get to quinolinic acid on the pathway, some of them are hallucinogenic, and some of them are neurotoxins. And if you got neurotoxins going on in your brain, it's not going to be conducive to good mental health. The other amino acid I want to talk about is tyrosine. Comes from animal meats, poultry, eggs, dairy, fish, soy, and spinach again. And there's others, those are just the key ones. So we take tyrosine, gets converted by enzymes into something called L-DOPA, which is then made to dopamine, which gives us motivation, learning, meaning, happiness. And then norepinephrine that gives us attention and alertness, and then epinephrine. So it's important that we process these properly. And so we need the vitamins again, so vitamin D, vitamin B6, vitamin C, and SAM-E. Dopamine gets made into norepinephrine. And when people get too much dopamine or they don't convert enough to norepinephrine, they can back up, and that is tied to things like schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, anxiety. The other component of the brain is lipids, so fats, fatty acids, and cholesterol. This makes up about 60% of the brain. So interestingly, low-fat diets are not good for the brain, and high-fat diets are. Now, the fatty acid composition of the brain looks somewhat like this: saturated fats, about 30%, mono, about 30, and polyunsaturated fatty acids, a little bit less. And if we look at the polyunsaturated, we have a little more omega-6 than omega-3s. These are samples from elks, and the reason this is a good sample to use to basically determine the profile of fatty acids is elks don't eat meat, so they have to make their fatty acids or get them from plants. So they structure the composition of the brain is what you would expect to be normal. And it turns out when you compare it, it is a good model. The fatty acids are built into membranes like this. On the left side, there is that ball with the two sticks. The ball represents a glycerol backbone, and the two sticks is the fatty acids. So we build this double layer fatty acid structure and incorporate that as the wrapper of the brain, or all cells in the body, but especially the brain cells. And then into that wrapper, we put all the gates and receivers and portals and everything needed for the cell membrane to communicate with the outside world and its inside world and allow nutrients in and out. So essential fatty acids in the brain, they're required for the structure of the brain. Nerve impulse requires essential fatty acids. Essential fatty acids are one of the molecules that regulate inflammation in the body, especially the long chain omega-3 fatty acids. Essential fatty acids have roles in all aspects of neurotransmission. So everything from creating the neurotransmitter, moving it, releasing it, docking it, reuptaking it, and disposing of it are all tied, or essential fatty acids are tied to them. Here's some of the plant sources of essential fatty acids, and the acids would be in the oil part of the nuts or seeds. We also get essential fatty acids from some seafood especially, and wild game as well has small amounts of it. So here's some research talking about essential fatty acids and mental health conditions. So omega-3 supplementation during stress lowers inflammation and anxiety. Inflammation is a driver of anxiety. So if you lower the inflammation, you can lower the anxiety. The study cited the 14% interleukin-6, which is it's an inflammatory molecule. The LPS is lipopolysaccharide, which is a toxin released by bacteria. So we learned two things there. Toxins from bacteria can raise inflammation in the brain, and that can be lowered by essential fatty acids. And then in this study, there's a 20% decrease in anxiety symptoms, and that's quite significant. EPA and DHA, so the omega-3 fatty acids, improved major depression in children between 6 and 12 years old. And there was the dosing that was done in the study, just 400 milligrams, 200 milligrams, so 400 EPA and 200 DHA, which is what you would get in a typical fish oil supplement. Low DHA and high omega-6 to omega-3 ratios predicted suicide. So what this means is the ratio between omega-6 and omega-3 is important. That balance dictates mental health. And so this is very disturbing because not a lot of people get omega-6 and omega-3. And so low DHA levels tied quite statistically to significantly to suicide. Cholesterol in the brain. So cholesterol is very important. And why? Because the serotonin receptor is the ones that dock serotonin and give us the positive signal, require cholesterol. Activates oxytocin receptors. Oxytocin is the pair bonding molecule that keeps people connected to each other. We need cholesterol to make vitamin D. So vitamin D is made by exposing cholesterol in the cell membranes of skin cells to UVB light. And then there's a cascade of enzymes that ultimately make vitamin D in the body. Bile production. So cholesterol is required to make bile. We need bile to absorb fat. Remember, 60% of the brain is fat. We also need bile to absorb fat-soluble vitamins, the A, D, E, and K. And we need them for steroid hormones, so estrogen, progesterone, testosterone, cortisol, and aldosterone. And we need cholesterol to make those. So low cholesterol is a risk factor for impulsivity and mood symptoms. So we're going to move on to antioxidants. Antioxidants are really important for the brain. One of the things they do is they donate electrons. And so free radicals damage the body by stealing electrons and changing the structures of substances in the body. And antioxidants donate electrons so that we can stop those reactions. So antioxidants protect from free radicals. So vitamin C, which is one of the main antioxidants, is required for serotonin and dopamine regulation. It's required for the integrity of the nerve cells, blood vessels, to protect fats in the brain. The fats, roughly 30% of fats in the brain are highly susceptible to oxidization or free radical damage. So vitamin C helps protect them. Vitamin C is anti-inflammatory as vitamin C. And it also protects from overstimulation from glutamate. So glutamate is the main excitatory molecule. And if you have too much glutamate, you can actually damage your cells. So vitamin C protects against that. Interestingly, vitamin C is depleted by stress. So stress will cause problems with all those things. Vitamin C food sources, there's the plant sources there, and they're basically the best. There's way more sources, but those are the key ones. So vitamin C and mental health, poor vitamin C tied to increased depression following acute illness in older people. One thing about acute illness is it can drive vitamin C levels down to 0. So high proportion of older patients had suboptimal vitamin C, and that was associated with depression in this study. Now on to vitamin D. Vitamin D is required to make serotonin, dopamine, proper neurons, protect the brain, and calcium regulation. So we think about calcium as important for bones, but calcium is the main driver of the nerve impulse in all nerves, but especially in the brain. And the key thing here is too much calcium causes overstimulation of brain cells, which is not good. If you live above the red line, which we do, you cannot make enough vitamin D from the sun. Well, you can, but it has to be between mid-May. So starting this week to mid-September, the rest of the year, we cannot make enough vitamin D from the sun. And so we have to get it from food. Here's the food sources. You'll notice that they are all from the animal kingdom, except for mushrooms. The source of vitamin D that humans use is vitamin D3. The D3 in mushrooms is D2, so it's not exactly the same. And it does work to some degree, but mostly the sources we want have to be from animal. So vitamin D protects against depression. Serum 25-OHD, which is the blood measure of vitamin D, was measured in over 600 people, and they found that the level of the vitamin D in the blood predicted depression in the group. And prevalence of and correlates vitamin D. So basically, here's what they did. They looked at people with mental health issues, and they found that 94% of them had inadequate vitamin D. Pretty strong correlation. B vitamins are really important for mental health as well. So we have B1 provides energy. Brain cells need energy just like all other cells. And B2 provides energy, B3 does energy, but B3 is also a mood stabilizer. I use it often with anxiety and definitely use it with schizophrenia and other serious disorders, mental disorders. B5 we use for energy. It's required for stress management, for making cortisol and acetylcholine. B6 is very important, which we're going to see through the rest of this talk. It's tied to methylation, which we're going to talk about. We have folate and B12. B12 is important for methylation, but also nerve health, so the health of the actual nerves. Then choline, which is required to methylate and make acetylcholine. More on that coming up. Right now, so methyl groups are carbons and 3 hydrogens. They kind of look like that. We stick them on things and take them off to regulate many, many processes in the body. The main methyl donators to be able to do this are folate, B12, choline, and betaine. This is called the folate cycle or the methionine cycle, depending where you start with it. And it's a bunch of cycles of enzymes in the body that are interconnected, and they are tied to mental health. So I've highlighted the ways that the folate cycle and methionine cycle affect mental health. And so basically what happens is folate goes in and it runs through many enzymes. B12 is in there, has roles. And so we use methylation to turn things on, turn things off, build molecules, activate DNA molecules, things like that. We convert methionine to homocysteine, which is toxic, but with the proper nutrients, we can make it the glutathione, which is beneficial. We use folate and the cycle to make energy for the cells. And also the cycle activates dopamine and serotonin. If any part of that cycle doesn't work, then the issues will show up throughout all of the cycles. So onto B12, and then we're going to tie everything together. B12 deficiency symptoms: apathy, depression, irritability, anxiety, and then long-term deficiency, permanent nervous system damage, including the brain. So folate and B12 food sources. Folates come from plants and the B12 comes from animals. There is no sources of B12 in any plants. You can get minor amounts from things like chlorella and spirulina, but dietary, these are the big ways. So if you're not eating the animal sources, you must supplement B12. So neurology of folic acid deficiency. Folates and B12 fundamental roles in the central nervous system function at all ages, and so prevention of disorders, nervous system development, mood, dementia, Alzheimer's disease, and the list actually goes on and on and on. And now we're on to magnesium. So magnesium in mental health, it is anti-inflammatory in the brain, and that is one of the biggest benefits. Magnesium is my favorite mineral, largely because of this list. It calms neurotransmission between glutamate and GABA. So basically, it helps convert that glutamate to GABA and calm the transmission down. It's required for the synthesis of dopamine and serotonin, and regulates cortisol levels and in the brain especially, but throughout the body. So pretty important there. One of the other things is it increases BDNF, which is brain-derived neurotropic factor. BDNF is a molecule that stimulates the connections between neurons. So more branching, more connections, which means smarter, more intelligent, quicker thinking, but also BDNF protects the cells from damage and imbalances. So things tied to magnesium deficiency: poor memory, poor concentration, depression, anxiety, nervousness, and ADHD, autism. Magnesium is depleted by stress. So something that's interesting here is calcium is stimulatory and magnesium is, we'll say, calming. They balance each other in the brain, but under stress, you lose magnesium, but not calcium. And so it's a big problem. So magnesium is also muscle relaxant, which feeds back to the body and says, oh, maybe I'm not stressed. So it's got a few beneficial roles. Magnesium food sources are there, and yeah, we don't really need to go through them, but quite a few and easily available if you eat those foods. Some studies about magnesium in the brain. Strong data suggests magnesium in migraine headaches, so deficiency in depression and chronic pain, anxiety, and even stroke. So important to get magnesium there. Another really important mineral is zinc, and zinc's required to maintain the structures in the brain so that they are wired properly and stay that way. It's required for every aspect of neurotransmitter activity. All of them, including reuptake and detoxification and docking, and that's required for enzymes. So zinc is required for virtually all digestive enzymes, and the way the body digests nutrients impacts the way the brain works. Zinc's also required for enzymes in the brain. So zinc in the brain increases serotonin uptake, so more of a calm and blissful signal, actually has an antidepressant effect, and deficiency is tied to major depression. So food sources of zinc include oysters and crab and beef, pork. We have turkey, beans, yogurt, nuts, and peanuts. Hang on one second. Just give me a second here. Just have to save a little message to myself. Okay, so zinc deficiency common in several psychiatric disorders, and psychogeriatric patients. Interesting thing here is most people in homes and the elderly are deficient across the board in nutrients, and that might be the driver for most of their issues, including mental health issues. And so prominent psychiatric patients, and especially in disorders other than depression, so anxiety and bipolar and things like that. I'm going to talk about confounders, so things that are bad for mental health. And there are many of them. I'm just going to talk about a few of them. So digestive issues. So if we don't digest our food properly, then we don't digest our proteins properly. If we don't do that, some of the amino acids we would have gotten out of the protein will not be absorbed, and some of them will be turned into toxins, which is not good. So we get less amino acids. Amino acids are required to build neurotransmitters and other proteins in the brain. We're going to get decreased digestion of gluten and casein. Gluten and casein are components of, well, first the gluten is from wheat and casein is from dairy, and those molecules, when they're not digested, have problems, which I'm going to talk about. And then we increase production of neurotoxins in the gut. And so if you have neurotoxins in your digestive tract, then they will get absorbed and go into the brain. We're also going to get increased toxins in the brain from the GI tract. We're going to have more inflammation in the brain, which is not good, and more immune reactions in the brain, which we do not want to have. Blood sugar is a big problem. Well, blood sugar crashing or rising and crashing is a big problem in the brain, and that can result in less focus, anxiety, depression, more cortisol and more epinephrine, and then a crash of those. None of these are good for keeping the brain stable. Blood sugar raises insulin, and insulin is a driver of inflammation. Food allergies is another big one. A lot of people eat their illnesses and because they're allergic to them. So foods that we're allergic to can trigger inflammation in the brain, change neurotransmitter activity and function. So increasing some that we don't want or making them go where we don't want them to go. And it can trigger low blood sugar in the body, but also in the brain. So here's the 7 foods that account for 93% of almost all allergy reactions. This is from Dr. Greenblatt and his years and years of experience working with food allergies and mental health. And so it is the things that people eat most often. So there's the list. And why would it be the things that people eat most often? Because if you have leaky gut or a damaged intestinal tract, you are going to leak in most what you eat most, and you're going to have an immune response to what is in your system the most. And take a look at gluten and dairy. So gluten and intention and focus, this is celiac, but celiac is a gluten issue. It's mostly genetic, but there are other gluten issues. The relevance is that it has to do with gluten in the body. This was a study tied to ADHD. So what they found was if you eliminated the gluten, the beneficial effect for ADHD in 64% of the children. And then if you gave it the gluten back, then they went back to the way they were. That is a pretty clean study, pretty accurate showing of what can happen. Here is some of the reason why gluten and dairy are problems. So if we ingest gluten and dairy, it gets chopped up by enzymes in the digestive tract to gluten and casein. The pancreas makes enzymes that will chop those up into gliadorphin and casomorphin. And then there's an enzyme inside the microvilli cells, the absorptive cells, called DPP4, that will then chop those guys down into dipeptides. So 2 amino acids linked together, and we can absorb those and not have any issues. However, a lot of people have problems with DPP4. It's inhibited by toxins and stress and some hormones and things. And so what happens is the gliadorphin and casomorphin do not get broken down, and they get absorbed, and they activate opiate receptors in the brain. So for most people, about 95% of the population, if you were to slightly activate your opiate receptors, you would feel really good. This might be where the addiction to grains comes from and dairy comes from, is docking opiate receptors and feeling good. The problem is in about 5% of the population, docking those receptors can cause anxiety and panic and disorientation. And this is one of the drivers of things like schizophrenia, or one of the components of schizophrenia in some people. So just looking at the gluten component, this was in Nutrients in 2018. Mood symptoms frequently reported with wheat and tied to gluten antibodies, so the immune system is going after it. So we see it in bipolar, depression, and schizophrenia. Okay, so other issues, glutamate and aspartate, these are molecules that excite neurons, they excite neurotransmission. And I have seen slides where they put glutamate in petri dishes with neurons, and the neurons literally explode. So that's what happens in the brain at a smaller level. So glutamate is excitatory, and the key source is MSG, so monosodium glutamate, and the analogs, things that look like it. They're put in there as a flavor enhancer. Ironically, the enhancing of the flavors happens in the brain and not in the food. A lot of processed foods have glutamate as well. Aspartate is an analog for glutamate, so it looks the same, docks the same receptors, and so aspartame and other artificial sweeteners have aspartate, so they can cause issues as well. There are stimulants that are a problem for the brain, especially on the anxiety side, so caffeine and nicotine. I'm not really opposed to caffeine in proper dosing and the proper time and the proper place. It does have some benefits, especially for upregulating detoxification. But if somebody is burning out from anxiety, throwing a stimulant in is not going to be conducive to good health. Nicotine is another stimulant, and I don't think I have anything good to say about nicotine. Environmental toxins play a big role in mental health, especially heavy metals. And so if we look at mercury toxicity, and we look at the people who have heavy metals, depression, about 75% of them have heavy metals, memory loss, 70%, anxiety, but 69% have heavy metal exposures. That's pretty strong correlation there. The one that horrifies me is unintentionally dropping things. So people who do that, 60% of them have toxicity from heavy metals. Horrifies me because I actually had mercury poisoning when I was going through my very dark, sick phase of environmental toxins, heavy metals and all that stuff. And that drop things all the time. And so that might be a marker for you. Lots of heavy metals tied to brain issues, cadmium, mercury. What else do we got there? Lead. So here's one of the questions. If somebody has anxiety, depression, does the doctor ever ask them, have you been exposed to heavy metals? Probably not. Pesticides are another problem, and pesticides are everywhere in the environment. And here's a study done with pesticide sprayers, so people who sprayed it. And they basically found strong correlation between pesticides and mental health issues. So I'm going to take a look a little more on the actual issues here: stress, anxiety, and depression. So causes and contributors of stress. Dysbiosis, so having poor digestion, yeast and mold buildup in the digestive tract, not being able to digest properly. Leads to all kinds of problems. And one of them is not being able to absorb your foods, but also if you can't absorb it, the food becomes food for your bad guys, we'll say, and you don't get your nutrients. Excessive sugar and starch. So starch should be considered sugar because it's essentially glucose molecules strung together. So starch and sugar are essentially equivalents. And so if sugar goes up, then we're going to be stimulating the brain and stimulating inflammation. Negative environments. So this comes in as a holistic side, so a little bit away from the nutrient side, more into the holistic. So the environment you live in can be stress-inducing or stress-modulating. And so most people don't look there. A lot of people don't consider anything outside of their physical body is the problem, but yes, that can be a driver. Lack of sleep has been shown over and over and over again to promote stress. Lack of sleep is, sleep is builds the immune system in a positive way, and it keeps inflammation down. Sleep is important for detoxification of the brain. When we are asleep, the gaps or the tight junctions between cells in the brain relax a bit to allow the toxins to be picked up and removed from the brain. So sleep's really important. Sleep's also the time when we consolidate memories and interact with our higher self. And so all of those are needed to keep stress down. Emotional issues. So people carry emotional issues. Sometimes there's major trauma, and sometimes it's just minor things that build up. And if they are not dealt with, then they can contribute to stress. A lot of bad habits, smoking, things like that, excessive alcohol can increase stress. And we have excessive exercise. This is the case of dose makes the poison. So exercise is actually stress reducing. Excessive exercise encourages stress. And that's because excessive exercise is pro-inflammatory, causes free radical damage. So it's about moderation and the right amount. The kind of exercise you want, or the stress from exercise, is the kind that goes away 5 to 10 minutes after it's over, like playing a rigorous hockey or soccer game. And so you're stressed during the game, but then when the game ends, the stress goes away. Stress system is activated. So when we are running our stress response, we are essentially in fight or flight mode. Fight or flight mode was very beneficial for us 10,000, 20,000 years ago when we were being chased by a woolly mammoth and we were either going to run or we were going to fight. Either way, it would have been over in a couple of minutes, and the stress response goes up and then it's gone and then we're calm. problem is nowadays we have subclinical fight or flight response. So we have like 80 or 50% of that response and all the things that go with it. And it is 24/7, and that's damaging to the body. Stress, when we're up, we are pro-inflammatory, so inflammation throughout the body and the cells. Free radicals are generated, and we stay in that context, which is bad. We get the state of insulin resistance. So we have insulin telling our cells to take glucose in for energy, but the cells don't listen. They're resistant to the signal. The stress is excitatory neurotransmissions, so we're going to be more on the anxiety side, keeps us awake, and then it keeps us thinking, and the immune system and all the systems thinking about survival versus repair, and so the body degrades over time. The thing about stress is we can be at, it's actually a continuum, so we can be anywhere in the continuum between super excited on the left and exhausted on the right there. And we actually deal with them slightly differently, but there are certain things in common that we work with. So stress has many manifestations. Anxiety and depression now, so office stress, anxiety, and depression, causes, contributors, deficiencies of nutrients are big drivers, especially B6, vitamin C, magnesium, and zinc. Blood sugar going up and down can drive anxiety and depression. Gluten and food intolerances is another one. Low essential fatty acids, and then inflammation. These are all main drivers of anxiety and depression. So specifics, other than the ones we just talked about, specifically for depression, the adrenal depletion, which I believe Sophia talked about. And we put the depletion in quotation marks because they're not really depleted, they're just imbalanced and maybe not what to do. It's not like they're storing things and now they don't, but it's more accurately would be called, and starting to go that way now, is the HP axis underactivation. So hypothalamus pituitary adrenal system not working to its full potential. So when that system is low, you can get depression. Hypothyroid, thyroid hormone regulates a lot of things, but the main ones are metabolism rate. It affects the neurotransmitters, not only the amount, but the balance, affects hormones. So hypothyroid is a big driver. When everything slows down, tendency to go into depressive state. Low serotonin and low norepinephrine, those two molecules are actually stimulatory. And so, I mean, they make you feel good, but they're stimulatory. And so if you don't have them, you can't be stimulated out of the depression mode, so to speak. Anxiety is when the adrenals are kicking out too much cortisol, epinephrine. So that's one specific drivers there. Stimulants can do it. Food allergens, there are actually quite a few other drivers, but we'll leave it at that. So how would we address these stress, anxiety, and depression? We're going to start with what is good for mental health, generally speaking. So protein. Protein is one of the most important things. I remember speaking with Dr. Greenblatt about mental health. I think it was depression conference we were at. And so the first thing he looks at in people coming to him is, are they getting enough protein? Are they digesting or absorbing the protein? So protein, very important. Fats from animals, seafoods, and plants, so the whole spectrum of monounsaturated, polyunsaturated, and saturated fatty acids. Predominantly plant-based diet for most people. So lots of veggies, some fruit, although I don't think we actually need fruit, but we can survive on veggies. The thing is, it's not fruit and veggies, it's veggies and fruit, because fruit has blood sugar impacts. Probiotic foods. Humans evolved with bacteria in their GI tract for at least 20,000 years, and those bacteria have lots of roles, especially in modulating neurotransmission. It's quite interesting. You can give somebody a specific probiotic strain and it will reduce anxiety. That would be using it as medicine. Generally speaking, if you do probiotic foods, you're getting a good balance of probiotic strains and cultures that will help maintain the balance. Things to avoid: refined sugars and starches. We are addicted to those things as a society, but it's a big problem. Fried foods. So 60% of the brain is fatty acids, and the fatty acids that you use to build your brain are important. And fried fatty acids, so heating them up, damages them. And then what happens, starting with about 20 minutes after eating something fried, you start to swap out your good fatty acids with damaged ones, and that can affect your mood and behavior and a bunch of other things. I have met people who feel bad after eating fried foods, like say potato chips or fries from a restaurant. They feel bad within 20 minutes. And it's not because it's not feeling bad in the gut, it is because it's already swapping fatty acids into the brain that are damaged. We have artificial sweeteners, so we should definitely avoid those. If you see any sweetener that is artificial, yeah, don't do it, don't eat it. Some of the natural ones are okay. Stevia is fine. Some of the synthetic natural ones, they do have some issues, but they're way better than the artificial sweeteners. If it comes to doing a diet Coke or a regular Coke, I tell people, if you have to have it, do the regular, because you do not want that artificial sweetener. Food additives. So food additives are things that are foods that are not foods. And a lot of times, almost 99% of the time, they're there for the benefit of the food industry and not for you. A lot of these molecules interact with the brain, interact with systems of the body, and they are not good for you. There's a Dr. Feingold who showed that if you take food additives out, you can make majority of, or an impact on the majority of people with schizophrenia. You can reduce their symptoms. And if you put the food additives back in, the symptoms come back. Avoid the pesticides on the food, and so you want to eat organic as much as possible. And if you can't do that all the time, most people cannot because it's too expensive, then you go to, you just Google the Dirty Dozen and Clean 15, and you get the lists of the worst foods to avoid and then the clean foods to include. And you want to identify and eliminate any foods that you are allergic to. And that can be easier said than done, but you can do allergy testing or food elimination and things like that. But it is important to identify allergic foods. I will give you an example of why. When I did my practicum at IHN, I worked with, sat in the office with Dr. Kropp, who was an environmental doctor at the time, and for 10 days. And one day was sitting on the allergy testing. And so there was 12 people in the room, 2 nurses and me, and everybody else is being tested. And what they would do was take blood pressure and temperature and heart rate and of everybody in the room. Then they would go around and do a little prick test. So scratch the skin and put an allergen on. And then they would wait 15 minutes and take the temperature and heart rate and pressure again. And no differences, because if you're allergic to food, you get changes in those. There was a little girl, probably around 3 years old, and she was hanging on to the skirt of her mother, really shy. She wouldn't talk to anybody. And they went around the room, and when they got to her, they pricked her skin and put a little bit of allergen on the skin. And within 5 minutes, she was literally trying to kill her mother. It took 4 people, me included, to drag her off her mother because of the allergy reaction. They then did a neutralizing dose and she went back to normal. So if you can have a little bit of an allergen go through and cause that big of a mental change, just imagine what daily exposure can do and how important it is to take allergic foods out. So I don't remember which doctor said this. I've heard it many, many times at the Orthomolecular Medicine Conference, but if you take out the bad stuff, it almost doesn't matter what you eat. That's because the bad stuff is so bad, it overrides a lot of things. If you're building your meals, this is the basic setup that I advise most of my clients to do. About 1/8 of the plate should be protein, about 1/8 should be starches, although that can be somewhat less for some people. And 3/4 of the plate would be the non-starchy vegetables. And we need a good oil to build that brain. And there's some lists of oils there. And if you're doing plant-based, you do 2 parts of beans and legumes to 1 part grains instead of the protein starch combination. This way of eating is created to keep blood sugar stable, but it also has benefits of making sure you get the right amount of protein, the right amount of nutrients, the right amount of vitamins and minerals, and it's a good place to start. Supplementation for good mental health. Overall, vitamin C and magnesium are my 2 favorite nutrients to put in, and this is where I start with absolutely everybody. Vitamin D is a must. Most people don't get enough, and most people don't take enough. Anybody who has chronic health issues, I recommend that they get their vitamin D tested because you need to know. B complex. So all the B vitamins are tied to good mental health. So the B complex is a good general way to get them in. Fatty acids, plant-based and fish oils. I generally recommend virtually everybody take a fish oil once a day and a plant-based oil in a salad dressing, something like sesame and flax oil and olive oil would do that part. Pretty much everybody would need a multivitamin, multimineral because our food supply is massively deficient in nutrients. And then probiotics for most people. A lot of people tend to go too high in the probiotics and it causes all kinds of digestive issues and things like that. I tend to start with lower amounts and move up as needed. So specifically for addressing stress, I've repeated vitamin C and magnesium here because they are super important. Vitamin B5, so vitamin C, magnesium, and vitamin B5 are all required by the adrenals to make cortisol and epinephrine. And under stress, you deplete those nutrients. Zinc is also required. So with stress, zinc is really beneficial. And the plant-based oils, but we might be looking plant and fish oils, we might be looking at higher levels. So for depression and anxiety, we have the vitamin C and magnesium for both yet again, because they're very important for both of those contexts. On the depression side, vitamin B6 has roles throughout the brain on the antidepressant neurotransmitters and neurotransmission. We have zinc there. Tyrosine is a molecule that gets made into dopamine, and it's somewhat stimulatory. It's tyrosine, dopamine, norepinephrine, and then epinephrine. And then 5-HTP or tryptophan. 5-HTP, tryptophan, serotonin, they tend to be stimulatory. Serotonin is actually stimulatory in the brain, and so it brings everything up. On the anxiety side, we got the vitamin C and magnesium. Niacinamide, which is the non-flushing version of vitamin B3, good for bringing stress down. Lots of studies show that one. Vitamin B6 shows up again. Zinc, GABA, we can actually put in GABA that's the counter to glutamate, and it helps calm things down. A lot of discussion about, well, GABA is too big to get absorbed across the digestive tract. That is probably correct, yet there is plenty of research that shows that GABA does get in and affect the brain. I use it with people and it works well most of the time. Inositol is another molecule. It is a quasi-B vitamin, and the inositol gets built into the cell membranes of the neurons, and it modulates them in a way that's anti-anxiety. So to recap all this, mental health is brain composition, brain structure, chemistry, immune system, thoughts, and some other things I haven't talked about. All of the top four are influenced and driven by nutrition, and then thoughts are influenced and driven by the top four. So if you have mental health issues and you're not asking about all the stuff I talked about, like what type of heavy metal exposure, pesticides, am I getting my nutrients in? I got good digestion. If you're not covering all of those things, you're missing a great opportunity and big potential to deal with those issues. So that is what I have for today. I hope you got some good information from that.